Right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Anand Swami. I'm chair of the CDE this semester. Welcome to the second lecture in our Per Jacobsson lecture series. Our speaker today is Elsie Kanza. The two most notable items on her CV are that she's from the CDE class of 2000 and is now the ambassador from Tanzania to the United States and Mexico. I know I've told you personally in class, and many people have said to you that correlation doesn't mean causation. The exception there is except at the CDE, because we would like to take full credit for the connection between those two events. But after leaving the CDE, Elsie went on to the central bank, then to the finance ministry in Tanzania, and then was economic advisor to the president for 5 years. After which around in 2011, she went to the World Economic Forum, initially as a director, eventually as head of Africa, became a member of the executive committee, and in 2021, since 2021, she's been appointed ambassador. Along the way, she has won a string of awards, the Desmond Tutu Fellowship in 2008. At various points, influential magazines have put her in the top 50 most influential people. So Forbes magazine twice, 50 most influential women in Africa, 50 most influential people in Africa, and then the name of a magazine whose name I'm going to struggle to pronounce, Jeune Afrique, which also declared her one of the 50 most influential people in Africa just a few years ago. But perhaps the most interesting, so there's actually a long list of accomplishments, and I don't want to keep you from her. I'll just mention, if you look at the website of the Tanzanian government, of the embassy, it describes Elsie and says, since 2011, when she went to the World Economic Forum, she's been working to change the narrative of Africa. That makes her a particularly attractive guest. Over the next 2 days, I expect Elsie will do that. On a more personal note, I should just say that it's a somewhat sentimental occasion for me. Elsie was the class of 2000, my first year here, John Bakia's first year here, Tom Power's first year here, and so we remember that class vividly, and Elsie was probably the youngest person in that class and one of the most brilliant, and also engaged with the community, a really positive presence. So we all remember her very affectionately and are really happy to have her today. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you, Anand, for that very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for introducing yourselves. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be able to come back. Since I graduated, this is the second time that I'm coming back. I was here for the 50th anniversary of the CDE, and 24 years goes by very fast, right? So I often get teased that I look much younger than I am. But working hard, which I believe you have experienced at Williams, keeps you young, right? Because you're always striving. So I thought I'd kick off with a question. How many of you are familiar with the notion of a true north? Have you heard of it? True north? True north. Okay. You probably definitely familiar with it. So I'll give you a couple of definitions just to set the scene. So one definition, which is the actual literal definition, is that on your compass is the direction that points directly towards the geographic North Pole, right? And this is a fixed point on the Earth's place. So just think about it as having a very clear target that you're headed towards, and regardless of which paths you meander upon, whenever you feel a bit lost or unsure about where you are, or if you take different twists and turns, you always have a clear direction that you're headed towards. A more sort of slang definition, and this if you Google, you'll come across, is getting on the right course or proceeding in the right direction. I came across a book in 2007 by Bill George, which refers to True North as a guide to your inner compass. And the reason I share this is that as I started my professional career, I started with the Central Bank of Tanzania. My passion was development. So my interest was to contribute to the transformation of my country, but very much concerned about development. And my background initially was in finance and in international business administration. So training was really for the private sector. Then I joined the central bank in a country where the financial sector had been liberalized less than 10 years before, and found that a lot of the learnings that I had acquired did not make sense in the context I was in, because the financial market was not deep enough, was not developed enough, and had to invest more in better understanding, right, how you move from a more or less developed country to a more developed country where sophisticated instruments can be applicable. And that led me to decide to come back, to go back to school, because this was my second master's. My first master's was in finance from a Scottish university, University of Strathclyde. But I needed a stronger grounding in economics. I was accepted to Warwick in the UK as well as to CDE. I chose to come to the CDE because it was more applied development economics at that time, and Warwick was very quantitative. And I'd already had a very quantitative master's program. And again, context matters, right? If you're in a sophisticated environment, it may make sense to have a more quantitative learning or expertise. But when you're in a developing country context where a lot of assumptions don't hold, it was important for me to get a better understanding of what that means and what are the factors that we need to take into account as we think about how we proceed forward. And the CDE offered me that opportunity. It was a recommendation from my supervisor at the central bank, and who had studied here. And when I asked him, he said, "This is what I'd like to do." He said, "Well, why don't you apply to the CDE, and the director will be here soon, and it's because you have to be interviewed before you're able to be accepted to the program." So that's how I arrived at the CDE, again, with the intention of better understanding the environment in which I was operating so that I could better apply myself, and found it was a good choice for me. It was, first of all, it was a small class. We were, 21 fellows? Tom will keep me honest, so even smaller than you are. This place was a lot smaller, very, very intimate, so you're very lucky. Although it was great for us at that time. And I mentioned something that that I took to heart, which was because I was coming with a clear purpose. It wasn't all just about learning and better understanding economics in general, but it was also about exploring a different environment. And there's a backdrop to that. One is at my time with the central bank, as we're opening up and we're getting foreign investors coming in, they'd often ask, what's your training, what's your background? And I still get it to this date. And the minute you say, "Oh, Williams," everyone's eyes kind of light up, and everything you say after that makes sense. So don't take for granted your credentials from Williams. It opens doors, and it definitely gets your attention. And then it's up to you to make sure that you're speaking common sense and properly leveraging that opportunity. And apart from that, I was also advised by a mentor of mine from the central bank, because I was known for being very intense with work, to also take advantage and to have fun. And so he alluded to really getting into the community, and I really made an effort to get involved in different extracurricular activities that were afforded to me. I hope some, if not all of you, were able to do that. But the biggest advantage that gave me was, one, a better understanding of America, of Americans, right? And not just international students. At that time, we were the major concentration of international students. I believe the Williams College is much more diverse because I've come across quite a few non-Americans who've graduated from Williams College. It was valuable then, and I find myself in this position now. And personally, you mentioned the correlation and causation, and I don't think it's by accident that I am in the US. So you can take some credit for that. It helps. And even with my segue to the World Economic Forum, it did make a difference that I had studied and worked. I worked briefly as a research analyst after graduating. I worked in DC, and that played a role because my prior training and experience was all in Africa, and I was moving to an international position. And so again, take advantage of having been here, and what you have learned, not just in the classroom, but also around. You never know how far that will take you. And the networks you've built, again, not just in the classroom, but also around this particular community. Because again, you never know when your paths will cross with other people that you are meeting here today. So post CDE, I returned to the Bank of Tanzania, and among others was involved in setting up our treasury bonds initiative in the country. Something to keep in mind, again, coming back to that true north, is I've also always focused on financing. So it's not just development, but how to finance development. So building on my career in the central bank, again, I was in open market operations where we were issuing government securities, and we would work closely with the Ministry of Finance as our parent ministry when we would issue securities because we're raising money for the government. And after about 2 years in, the Ministry of Finance felt that they lacked capacity. I don't know how many of you have heard of Overseas Development Institute Fellows. This is an initiative by the UK government, and so they provided experts. The last lot was actually from Pakistan that were helping them, and so they would be the counterparts to the central bank that had quite a few graduates from the master's program in finance, but there was a lack of capacity on the treasury side, which made it very difficult for them to interface effectively with the central bank, and so it would often slow us down. And so the assistant commissioner responsible for the unit that dealt with debt financing of the government asked me to join his team. And that's how I was seconded to the Ministry of Finance. And some of you may wonder why I chose to do that, and certainly many of my colleagues at the central bank thought I was crazy. For those of you central bankers, I don't know how it is in your country, but in Tanzania, as in many countries, I'm told, the central bankers are considered an elite group, and the Ministry of Finance somehow not as elite. And so the elite group could not understand why I would choose to work in a more difficult environment, definitely not as elitist as the central bank, but I was curious. And that's something I hope you've picked up here as well, is how to stay open, how to stay curious. There's no fixed pathway. Again, remember that true north. You never know which twists and turns you may take. But what's important is to stay open-minded. And the real appeal for me as well was moving from working in a single sector, which is finance, a central bank, working with banks and financial institutions, to moving to the Ministry of Finance, where you're working across government, because everything comes down to money. And the budgets are set in the Ministry of Finance, and that gave me an opportunity to understand how the government works. So again, applying the learnings from here in a different context. Very challenging also when you're dealing with different needs coming from different sectors and having to prioritize different needs, who gets more, who gets less. Everyone thinks that if there isn't enough revenue, then you should just borrow. So as part of the team, that made it difficult to borrow, that ensured that only the Minister of Finance had the authority, because prior to that, anyone could go anywhere, anytime, and sign agreements, right? And what that led us to, because then we were involved in that as a country, was the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, HIPIC, that you may have heard of. So we were all highly indebted, and we had to work very hard to bring inflation down, to get our budgets into control. And part of that process was the team that I was working with that was involved in the negotiations to bring the debt down, but also just introducing discipline into how the government sourced the funding that was needed. And to cut a long story short, because that was a segue to how I joined the presidency, is I was involved in the Millennium Challenge account or compact that was introduced by President Bush Jr. And this was an initiative by the American government. So again, you see, America, right, sort of repeats itself. To support the democratic efforts of countries, but by providing funds. They prefer not to call them grants because it's really more of a partnership arrangement. Need to comply with certain requirements, but essentially the resources assisted us with closing a gap, which is a critical gap for our countries, and that's infrastructure funding. And in the process of receiving the MCC team, because the process of developing a program is actually quite extensive, and we got to visit the new president, then President Kikwete, so 3 months into his first term, and shortly after I was appointed to the presidency. So my interaction again with America, right, had some consistency and led to that connection, again, seemingly by chance, but again, I was focused on the economic aspect of the presidency, and particularly looking at different financing avenues that are non-tax. So that's also one aspect that's critical. So I focus much more on debt financing, financing from multilateral institutions, as well as the private sector. So essentially think about how you close that shortfall in the revenue. So our domestic revenue mobilization is still much lower than we would like it to be. It requires a different set of skills to think about how to tap into resources that are not development assistance. In our Ministry of Finance, development assistance is handled by a very specific team as well. And they handle aid. As you probably know, we were all also heavily dependent on aid, but that was shifting as ODA globally. It started reducing, sort of stagnating and reducing, and so many of our countries were forced to think about other ways in which we could get assistance or be able to support the government's effort to close the financing gap. So with the presidency, key learning, again, staying on that true north, was learning how to mobilize resources, not just for the government, because of the presidency, I'd say, responsible for everything, including the birds and the bees. So it's the public sector, the private sector, you have civil society, you have nature. There were a couple of issues that came to the forefront in terms of the challenge as we think about transformation that hitherto I was not aware of, but when you were supporting the highest office of the land, and you have to think not just about your own needs as a country, but also situating yourself in the continent and globally becomes important. Implications of policies and decisions that you take in your context or are taken elsewhere that could adversely impact you. And the presidency was a segue to the World Economic Forum, because I was also the focal point for the president and the country with respect to the World Economic Forum. And I did interact with them within my first year. The country had had a relationship with the World Economic Forum since our second president, President Mwinyi. So this was back in the 80s, 90s. And what was critical about the World Economic Forum was that they were a partner and essentially provided a formal framework for engaging with non-public sector stakeholders. So with and in this I mean it's one thing to deal with the government and understand how the government operates, and it's very different when you think about, well, how can we combine forces with non-government actors to contribute to that development transformation effort. And it's not straightforward, is the easiest way I can put it. One, you have a conflict of interest inherently. If I just use a private sector, seeking to make a profit, not necessarily concerned with industries or sectors outside of their areas of focus. As a government, you always have to think nationally, what are the broad implications for everyone and not just for a single sector. And so it's a constant balancing act, a constant effort to foster trust, to explore how to collaborate together. And I'm sure this is one of the things that you'll be taking with you as well, is how to work with other stakeholders, not just from other countries, but other institutions with whom you have to negotiate, because all our governments have limited resources, and so inevitably there are trade-offs to be made. And you will only work together if you are interested in pursuing the same goals. So again, if we are interested, and in the context of the World Economic Forum, it was about accelerating the growth and development agenda for the continent. My team, as head of Africa, was responsible for the relationships with for managing directly relationships with governments across sub-Saharan Africa, and then creating bridges in terms of framing dialogues and identifying potential solutions to common complex issues such as climate change, such as we at one point were dealing with plastics in oceans, dealing with, we had Ebola at one time, how do you resolve that? So very complex issues where the government alone cannot solve those problems, but you need everyone to make a contribution and see how best you can find the right fit to be able to tackle these complex challenges. One of the key reasons that the World Economic Forum chairman actually borrowed me from the president was that while I served with the presidency, we were able to develop an initiative to transform the agricultural sector in Tanzania by crowding in the private sector. And this was already a local initiative that was taking place, where prior to that point, a lot of the investment in agriculture was driven by the public sector, who were not making much headway. And so agricultural sector, which remains a major employer in Tanzania, employing 60 to 70% of the population, but was not growing in terms of this contribution to GDP. And so part of the transformation of that sector was to see how to transform smallholders into agribusinesses, as well as to attract private capital, both domestic and international, into the sector, and to address different needs depending on what was a good fit. And the World Economic Forum gave us a global platform to be able to mobilize support. This support included working with international financial institutions, so the World Bank, as well as DFIs. So you have different partners like USAID in the case of the US, you had DFID, we had different financiers were involved. So not purely the private sector, because in some cases investments that needed to be made were capital intensive, and not necessarily the role of the private sector. So rural roads, right, irrigation, those are not traditionally investments that you would call upon the private sector to make, because they're very expensive. There's a broader benefit to everyone, but just being able to raise the capital was difficult. And so we needed partners to come in and fill in the gaps that would allow the private sector to play a more active role in the agricultural sector. The vision at that time was to have the program as a 10-year initiative. It was called the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridors of Tanzania, SAGCOT. It was based on actual physical corridor in Tanzania that's considered a breadbasket for the country. And I emphasize the 10 years because that was around 2010 that it was launched. And by 2020, that was already 10 years. I served on the founding board for the first 2 terms. And it was very difficult. And I say this again, returning to where I started with the true north, that you need to be patient. So there are no quick fixes. And it's a path that can get pretty frustrating at times. But even with SACOT, our intention was to think long term. And ultimately, it survived multiple presidents. So the successor to President Kikwete continued with the initiative. This was President Magufuli. We are now with President Samia, and the initiative continues, moving on to another phase. The country has adopted it, and so the unit that is running with it has been charged with the responsibility for developing an agricultural corridors of Tanzania strategy and to create clusters around the country. And for me, something that's very fulfilling about that was proving that the public sector and the private sector, or public sector and non-governmental sectors can actually come together and work together to drive transformation. A lot of lessons were learned. It's very complicated. We received a high sort of global award as an innovation in development that was highly respected because we literally had to set up an institution. This is a decision that Tanzania made. And the link to the World Economic Forum for this, it was the first time they had undertaken such a major initiative where you'd move from dialogue about what could work and to actually being on the ground, literally at the base of the pyramid, right, working directly with smallholder farmers, dealing with environmental issues right on at the micro level, and taking this long-term view as well. So this is not a project where you will see results in 1 year, 2 years. It's still underway. The process of transformation still continues, but we can see the progress that's been made. And the interest from the forum's point of view, learning from this model, was to see how we could apply this intervention that brings together public and private sector to other sectors and other needs. At that time when I joined, the focus was on infrastructure, but by 2015, at least for Africa, we had the biggest portfolio of different initiatives in different sectors, from health to water. I mentioned infrastructure, it could be energy, you had sustainability, and what was key, or what was a common thread, because now we're dealing with different countries, so going back again to that pathway, is how do you move from one country to then thinking about multiple countries, right, which are very different, operate differently, but have similar challenges. And again, this is something I'm sure you've experienced, where despite coming from different countries, you see certain common problems and different solutions being applied to them. The question is, when you're looking at solutions, particularly from a global perspective, how do you simplify them and then test them in different environments? And the portfolio is built up by essentially making it easy to test possible solutions in different countries at the same time. And from the stakeholder perspective, because the World Economic Forum is membership-based, what was helpful for them when they looked at Africa, say vis-a-vis Asia or Latin America, there's some initiatives that started in Africa and then went to other parts of the world. So from Africa, for agriculture, we had a Grow Africa initiative, and there was a Grow Asia initiative, and with infrastructure similarly, other regions in the world sort of adopted the learnings from these interventions in Africa. But for me, it enabled us to also determine or simplify the complexities of countries with respect to intervention. So, for example, let's use healthcare as an example, and we could use COVID. Why not, right? COVID, just an example. and trying to determine how fast you could make an intervention in which country is very much determined by how they operate. By the time we had COVID, there was a great familiarity with what could be done in which country, where you'd need to start with a presidency, where you could just start with a ministry, right, where the powers lie. We're dealing with the challenge where speed was also of the essence. And when you're testing innovations, again, with governments, you're always conservative because you can't afford to risk lives of people. So the faster you can prove that an innovation works, then the faster it can be replicated and duplicated elsewhere. And so having this combination of different pilots in different countries made it easier for innovators, and innovators could be from the public sector or private sector, able to be willing to experiment more in the countries. And a big part of development, as you know, is really about trying out new things. As I say, if we do things it's the way we've always done it, then we shouldn't be surprised by the results we get. And the fact that we're still talking about, at least in the context of Tanzania, we're still talking about transforming the country. It very much implies that we continue to need to have innovations and to be willing to adapt to circumstances and to incentivize thinking in different ways so that we can get different results. So that was a 10-year journey. It was initially for 3 years. It was renewed 3 times. And that marked my time at the World Economic Forum. One of my highlights was in 2015. I received an honorary doctorate from University of Strathclyde for the work that I did with these public-private partnerships while at the World Economic Forum. One of the complexities was that people talk about, continent and, countries had enough, ministries had enough, is again, how do you simplify the needs? How do you take into account that you're dealing with different countries and not just a single country as a continent? One of the important roadmaps, at least in the context of Africa, was the development, this is Agenda 2063, which is a development vision for the continent. And what you have there is a political will to drive forward certain initiatives that are priorities for all countries. And so at the World Economic Forum, we focused on those areas where there was an agreement on what the priorities were across countries. Otherwise, it gets too complicated when you start to work with national development visions. When I was with the Tanzanian government, I'm now back, so prior to the World Economic Forum, a guiding document was our Development Vision 2025, which was actually launched in 1999 when I joined the CDE. And we're currently finalizing the review of where we are versus where we thought we would be in 2025 as we look ahead to 2050. And what this does, at least for me personally, it provides a scorecard. Because again, the work that we do is as a team, as a whole, so it's with a whole of government approach. But particularly in this, with respect to development transformation, it's helpful to see how far we've come and how far we have not come, and where we have fallen short of the targets that we set. Our aspiration was to be a middle-income country by 2025 with a per capita income of about $3,000. We are below that target, but we did achieve low middle income status by 2020. As a country, we have some unique challenges that we continue to grapple with. Bear with me. One is we have a population of over 61 million people. It's growing by about 1 million people per year. That's over the last 10 years, one of the fastest growing populations in the continent. And that creates quite a bit of pressure in terms of the government's ability to service the needs in terms of primary health care, in terms of access to education. We now have universal primary education, universal secondary education. There's loans available for tertiary education, but we don't have enough capacity built. That's one of the findings from the scorecard. For development vision is we need to invest a lot more in the talent. And you say one of our key natural resources is our talent pool. Another unique characteristic for us is we have a very diverse country. We have over 123 tribes. Again, just to give you some perspective, because we're the largest country in East Africa. That's not something that many people are aware of, but you can actually fit Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi in Tanzania and have space left over. So it's a big country, very challenging in terms of the needs to meet that size of a country. For the Americans in the room, the countries, if Tanzania was a state, would be the second largest state after Alaska. We're 1.4 times the size of Texas. We're also somewhat equivalent in size to South Africa. South Africa has 11 tribes. We were talking yesterday about some challenges, if not arising from ethnicity. In Tanzania's case, we're very fortunate that the founding father of the nation invested heavily in creating a sense of one nationhood. And so we all have a national language, Kiswahili, English is a business language, and so it's more of a unified country. What it means, though, in terms of development is you have to think, first of all, you have to be very inclusive, right? You have to be very, very inclusive, and we work a lot by consensus. So Tanzania is not a country where you can dictate which way to go because you don't always see things the same way. And again, that's something I implore you to leverage based on your experience here at CDE, is how do you get to where you want to go when you're talking to people who see things from different perspectives, not necessarily, nobody is right or wrong, but you need to persuade them to come around to your way of thinking, to test some things, and perhaps you need to come away, change your way of thinking, right, and approach things differently to arrive at a better solution or better outcome. Again, with respect to replication, as I said, you start off with pilots and then you have to replicate with a country that's very diverse and as large as I mentioned. It's not very easy to develop nationally. You need to do it in phases. Start more at district, regional level, and then see how that applies to different regions. And so again, it's a space where you need to be constantly open to learning new things. There's never one solution that fits all, even within the country, leave alone outside the country. And this has its own challenges from a policy-making point of view, because as you appreciate it, you develop policies for the entire country. The question is, how do you arrive at the policies? And we strive to make that policy development process as inclusive as possible, but we don't always succeed. And with that, you get the backlash from those who have to actually who are on the receiving end of the policies that are taken by the country. And again, this is an area where you just constantly have to be learning from colleagues from other countries. I really hope that you're able to stay in touch, because as you go along with your careers, you may need to pick up that phone and speak to your counterpart in the Ministry of Finance in another country and say, but we're faced with this challenge. We see that you've dealt with it or you're dealing with it. Can you help us appreciate, how you've decided to address it, and what could be applicable in our context, and be able to move forward in that way, so that you minimize having to reinvent the wheel. And I'm hoping as alums we'll be able to reach out to some of you as well, because as we sit even in DC, there's some of the things where you say, it'd be great to speak to our counterpart and say, how are you addressing that? Or there's this, company, a global company that would like to come and work with us. What's your experience with them? Or what are some things that we should think about in our context, which is different from your context? So from the World Economic Forum, I was starting a sabbatical when the president nominated me as ambassador. I did not know where I was headed to, and I was very honored to be nominated and sworn in as ambassador to the US, and a big part of my task, and this is public, when I was being sworn in, was resource mobilization. And so I remain on that path. That's been a big part of the focus of what I do with my team in Washington, D.C. is on one hand, one major task was strengthening our relationships with the World Bank and the IMF. As of last year, we're the biggest recipients of concessional loans from the World Bank in Africa. We're very grateful. As I said, we have a lot of needs, but also, again, learning from the scorecard for the Development Vision 2025, a key concern has been that a lot of that funding has gone to support social infrastructure. And so we need to build up our economic infrastructure so that we can support the private sector, again, in Tanzania, as well as foreign investors investing in the country. This aspect of nurturing the private sector was also another finding from how we've performed over the past 20 years, that the private sector has not grown as much as it should have compared to other countries in the region or countries that are similar, whether in size or their position by virtue of GDP anywhere around the world. So those are the comparator countries. And so this is a critical challenge because at the end of the day, you can't run the government without revenue. And we cannot be dependent on assistance from outside the country. Then, as I said, also we're a fast-growing population. And so we have to keep up with the jobs that need to be created, a very young country. And it's the private sector that creates jobs, not the public sector. And so our President Samir, has been very resolute about nurturing the private sector actively. And so this means also from a resource point of view, working with the United States government as well as its agencies to see how we can support the private sector as well by improving the environment. Part of that, again, is still infrastructure development, but it's also improving institutions, accountability, efficiency, that is geared to putting the private sector in the driver's seat in terms of creating jobs and really driving the transformation of the country forward. As is true for many African countries, at least industrialization is a critical concern. We haven't been able to industrialize much over the past 20 years, but without value addition, then we're not getting incomes up and we're not able to modernize as fast as we can. Apart from working with government, also work with a range of other stakeholders, such as philanthropic foundations that are here, civil society organizations. So I continue to learn about how to work with different stakeholders and to try to get them to work together. So in this case, it's strengthening bilateral relations, but still pretty much that, how do you bring together different groups and say, well, how do we work together? And our interest is to, one, support the transformation of Tanzania, but it's also a win-win because there are things that the US can benefit from. So for example, we're seeing investment from Tanzanian companies to the US, particularly in the area of technology and the fourth industrial revolution. This opens up opportunities for more cross-fertilization, so to speak. And so this is an exciting part. When we're here, we didn't have the .com yet, so that happened after we graduated. It's been incredible to see the role that technology has played and continues to play. And this is also an area that's a key concern from a policy making point of view. How do we adopt new technologies? How do we stay ahead of the game, so to speak, from a governance point of view? We're all still playing catch up. We see that even here in the US and the global north, but it's important to see how we can harness technology and make it part of our toolkit when it comes to policy making, and not just have it as a sector, but actually an integral part of what we do. And so increasingly, you'll see more about AI and AI governance and concerns about how governments can work with AI as well as be able to ensure that it is leveraged for greater good rather than otherwise. So I'm going to pause there. I'm sure you have questions and happy to respond to those.
Thank you very much, Elsie. I should just clarify, you did exactly what I wanted you to do. Our thinking was that we were going to meet the speaker twice, once today and once tomorrow, and how would we divide the time? My thinking was today would be about Elsie and her career and what she learned through it. And tomorrow the interview will be more about looking ahead. So in some sense, this was looking back, and tomorrow we'll be looking ahead, sort of about especially the future of Africa, the challenges and so on. So thank you for doing exactly what we had in mind. The distinction is not watertight, so your questions can be more wide-ranging. But questions from the audience? So the first one always takes a while to show up.
Sure. Oh, she put her hand up.
Thank you so much for sharing all this with us. Your career is so impressive, so it's an inspiration for all of us, I think, because we are here and also we have this willing to go to our countries and be able to contribute in some way. So I wanted to ask you if how has it been like as a woman, like as a woman, to be in all this process, because I think things are changing and now it's more inclusive, but I imagine that it was harder like 20 years ago in all this path. So I just would like to see if you could share something about that with us.
So I'll answer your question in two ways. In one aspect, with respect to the finance as a sector, it's a sector, especially from an accounting point of view, but finance in general attracts women. So at least for us in Tanzania, the central bank, Ministry of Finance, we had even at that time quite a few women leaders and quite a few women, because at core, again, as I go back to my term of elitism of a central bank, it starts off with how you've performed, right, in economics, right, so foundational training. And so there was less of, not having enough women around you or as leaders, right, accepted in the profession, because the foundation was a training, right, as opposed to gender. The second key aspect of that is, yes, there's at a certain point, so for example, at the central bank, my boss was a woman, and her boss was a woman. When I moved to the Ministry of Finance, all my bosses were men, right? And then that was true at the presidency, and that was true at the World Economic Forum, and even now where I am, the minister is a man, but when I came in, the minister was a woman, but my president is a woman. And what I found helpful, and as you move up in your leadership careers, is really that my male bosses in particular, so when I was asked to be seconded, it was bosses who spotted talent, I guess, in me, and they gave me the opportunity. And I just worked really hard. Right? And so it wasn't about the gender, it was more about the results that they were interested in. And so this is something to be mindful of, right, is how to spot talent and to create space for it and to nurture it by providing opportunity. And I was very fortunate that I had opportunity provided that I was then able to step into.
Thank you very much. I've seen that you've moved in and out from the political aspect and also professional technical offices as well. How have you managed to work, because in Africa, of course, we know there's politics, which is so difficult, especially for you as a woman,
Sure.
and of course, working as a developmental person. So how have you maneuvered in working in these two spheres? And also moving into diplomacy as well, something different, and I'm sure you found several challenges working as an ambassador. Could you share some of those things as well?
So again, two key points. One, I worked for a politician, but I was never a politician. I was a technocrat, right? So even at the Ministry of Finance, I don't know if some of you, if you remember at all, it was an old series, UK series about Yes Minister. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you see it. So there's always a distinction also in the Ministry of Finance between the office of the minister and the bureaucrats, right? So you always have the elected politicians and you have the bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats always stay and the politicians come and go. With the presidency, I was still a technocrat, right? So I was part of his economic advisory team, and so again, still focused on the democratic aspects while being more mindful of the political fallout. So different from when you're in the bureaucracy, particularly when you're in the presidency, you constantly have to pay attention to what the negative fallout could be, because the public will tell you. You have a direct responsibility to the public. At the World Economic Forum, not really political. You're dealing with politicians, but again, it's still more from a technocratic perspective. As ambassador representing your head of state, and so by definition, it takes on more of a political nature, and it's a fine balance. What we try to do as much as possible is that we are supporting government. We fall under the ambit of government and not political parties per se. But you have to be inclusive, so inclusive to everyone, regardless of what the political affiliation could be, and really just focusing on what the terms of reference are. And our terms of reference are defined by the development vision that we are essentially finding different solutions to ensure that we're contributing to that. In Tanzania's case, we have 5-year development plans. So you have the development vision for 25 years, but you have 5-year development plans. So for all the ambassadors, coming in, have your marching orders. You have to read. First of all, you have to know what the party manifesto is, because the government is run by a particular party and they have set targets. But more practically speaking, you have a 5-year development plan, and we're all part of the team. So it's a whole of government approach, and so you have to think, like in my case, okay, so how do I nurture relationships in the US that can help us contribute to meeting the targets that are defined in the 5-year development plan? So in that sense, it's not quite political. It's just that when you start to think about potential fallout, you cannot just focus on technical aspects. You have to think much broader about, what are the implications of this? And then as a diplomat, you also have to think, well, what are the implications as far as the neighbors are concerned? So for example, just for the benefit of everyone, we border 8 countries, 6 of which are landlocked. And so as we think about, well, how can we work with American agencies to invest more in infrastructure? We don't just think about infrastructure for Tanzania. We have to think about infrastructure that connects the landlocked countries that need to use our port. And so constantly thinking, how do we connect to the border? How do I work with my counterparts from other countries? And so if we're speaking to the IFIs, we also tell them, this is a shared project. You will negotiate separately, but we have a shared objective. And so diplomacy becomes really important. You cannot just say, I'll just focus on my country and my corner of the world. Other aspects of diplomacies, we also have to think about regional peace and security. Without stability, there is no development. So again, that adds a different dimension. And at our embassies, we all have defense attaches, for example, and they facilitate sort of engagement in that aspect. So as the ambassador, you have to keep an eye on all of that. And then we have diaspora as well that we have to work with. Yes?
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, for the good presentation. First of all, I'm very inspired to see you here because I'm also a central banker on the Bank of
Yes.
Tanzania, and to see you on the world stage, I'm very happy for you and I'm inspired. So my question is regarding to the specific to Tanzania. I know we have the single citizenship policy. Do you think this policy is limiting our resource mobilization capacity? Given that remittances, we recently know that the remittance flows are one of the highest share in the globe of financial inflows, and recently they have been more stable. While the world has been in shocks, but remittances have been more stable compared to the other flows like FDIs and aid and loans. So do you think, in the case of Tanzania, the single citizenship policy, is it limiting our capacity to invest more resources from foreign nations?
Tanzanian diaspora is small in comparison to countries in the region. So when you look at the pool, again, say, I have finance bias to development financing. You look at the pool of different resources and which ones are more important than others. And as a contributor to, if you look at the composition of resource mobilization that the country has, it's not a major contributor. Yeah, so that's not to say that the diaspora doesn't have a role to play, but just from a financing point of view, I beg to differ in that context. I know you've used a global example, but there are countries that have millions of people in the diaspora. And for them, that's very significant in terms of the proportion to the population back home. A big bulk of our population is in the country. And because you're Tanzanian, say if you read the report on the Development Vision 2025, you will see that one of the challenges is that the country somehow become more inward-oriented. So even the industries that have been built up are targeting domestic consumers rather than external consumers. So there's a lot of activity that is still based internally. And so as you think about mobilizing diaspora, perhaps it's through, whether it's investment, we see expertise, people provide expertise, and so you have engagement on that basis. Another Tanzanian.
Yeah. Thank you, Elsie. Your CV is very impressive. As a person also, I work from the ministry there, so it feels good to see you front there. My question is, with the way artificial intelligence is growing, it means digital economy is also growing. What are the opportunities that you see, particularly for the youth, in terms of the digital economy, and what would your advice be on the best ways they can harness that?
Well, you have opportunities in terms of employment.
Yes.
Not just within countries, but also globally. So you have the gig economy. You have quite a few openings, even here in the US, that can be serviced and are being serviced by people who are located outside of the US. And COVID-19 made this even more palatable, that you did not have to be in the same location as your job. You just needed to have the skills that are required. We've seen the role that this digital technology has played in terms of skills acquisition. So it's a lot more online learning that's available. There's opportunities in terms of new companies that are being created. So for instance, I gave the example of a Tanzanian founder who has a payment solution currently focused on remittances. This is Nala, and he's opening an office in New York. He's already in the UK, he's already in the EU, he's in a number of African countries as well. And so it offers up a new way to contribute to not just the local economy, but global economy, where the barrier to entry is low, because it does not have to be highly capital intensive for the most part. When you start to get into data centers, it becomes a lot more expensive and demanding, but it's definitely an area where it's easier for new businesses to get involved in the economy. As a country, in Tanzania's case, we've also seen the adoption in terms of government operations. So it also helps in terms of transparency, accountability, addressing issues related to corruption and governance is a key concern. The other area in which we're seeing the application, which is again useful for people, is when we talk about rights and access to justice, which is also important. So whether it's using mobile units, we have mobile courts, as you may be aware. It's been a deliberate effort to take justice to people. So it's allowing us to provide more access to people by being able to take these services to them. This is also true for healthcare with e-health, as opposed to having people have to follow those services. So it allows for much more inclusive participation in the country's transformation efforts. Yes. Oh, you've spotted two? Okay, I'll leave it to you.
I missed the first half.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for the presentation. I'm happy today is Africa Day, so we are celebrating it with you. My question is on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Do you think the signing of this agreement is going to provide the much needed or improve the intra-Africa trade, or is just something on paper? Because some of the agreements that have been signed, they've not been producing the much needed results. So what's your take on the FICFITA?
The FCFTA?
Yes.
Yes. I believe that it is very positive. It's taken a long time to get to where we are now, going beyond just the ratification, but actual implementation, where you could say more could have been done, or they could have started the process earlier. It was bringing on board non-government stakeholders to better understand what it is and how it's a benefit to them. So a lot of negotiations happened more between governments, and it was only after it was the process of negotiation was being completed and ratification was taking place that you had more deliberate outreach to stakeholders, particularly the private sector, and particularly those companies that are engaged in cross-border trade, to get them to appreciate how this could be of value to them and what the implications are vis-a-vis where they are. Now, having said that, it's still aspirational, right, to have one market, because there are a lot of steps that need to be taken. One, just for negotiation, is that there's still issues that are under negotiation. For instance, e-commerce, for instance, there's no full agreement on that. So negotiation on that is still happening. Very practically speaking, also, is you have regional blocks, we call them RECs, regional economic communities, like the East African Community, Southern Africa Development Community. You have ECOWAS in West Africa, Central Africa is North Africa as well. And within these groupings, and COMESA as well, and you have SACU in Southern Africa, is that they're agreed protocols that take different dimensions. So it could be related to payments and settlement systems, it could be related to tariff barriers, it could be related to free movement of people, free movement of capital, with digital technologies, also data and how you manage data. And the from a process point of view, the goal is to increase the improvement and use those regs as building blocks to get to the full-fledged AFCFTA. Because even within these regs, and EAC is the most advanced, you don't have full harmonization of regulatory frameworks, and that's one of the biggest restrictions. That if I get licensed in one country, I have to get licensed in a second country, third country, and fourth country. So if we can get to a point where if I'm licensed in one country, I can operate in all, then it starts to become more realistic. There's also always that ongoing concern about, well, are we giving too much away, right, in terms of reducing tariffs, and so countries want to also buffer themselves. And so to counter that inherent reluctance, you have a lot of discussion about regional value chains. So how can we ensure that there's deliberate effort to make sure that no country becomes a net importer? Nobody wants to just be on the buying side. They also want to sell. Then they're much more willing to ease tariffs, and that is a barrier to entry. And also much more open to free movement. We still have concerns about the free movement of people across the continent. You have it within RECs, but not necessarily across the continent. And a big part of that is that we're at different stages of development, and there's that concern about, we don't want to yield too much ground, and then we will suffer, our industries will suffer, and you always have the industry lobbyists who want to protect their interests, but you also, and there's some validity as well. And so concern with regional value chains is, how can we ensure that we are moving in tandem? And so think about the full-fledged AfCFTA as the direction we're headed towards, but the speed with which we'll get there will depend on how we're able to find balance between our countries, and then also just the realistic hurdle of connecting the continent. Because yes, you may have a free trade area agreement, but I can't move my goods across the continent. I have to go outside to come in, and that's not practical. And that's why you hear a lot of appeals for continued support for infrastructure development in the continent, and particularly infrastructure that connects countries, and in particular now connecting different regions. How do you connect East Africa to West Africa so goods can travel, whether it's by land, by rail, right, or by air. We still don't have free open skies fully across the continent. And those are practical elements. But the big concern is, you tend to want to protect and ensure that you're fine, your economy is fine, your people are fine before you fully open up. And so building that trust and proving that they're success stories. And there are some efforts now with piloting. There was a pilot between South Africa and Ghana, for instance. Tanzania is also involved in part of the pilot is to test that so that people can actually see practically, does this work? Do we benefit from it? And as policymakers, we can learn from where there could still be gaps and areas for improvement so that we can scale up.
So I think what we do is we have actually another event tomorrow. And a chance to actually really look ahead to free trade area and so many other issues. And also the opportunity cost of discussing economics is quite high today. It's a beautiful day. So we take one more question for today and reconvene tomorrow at 10 o'clock for further discussion at great length. So,
thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your talk. I know this is a big question, but still I thought maybe you have some general ideas to share about that. I was thinking about the colonial history of first of all the Germans and then the British. And I was wondering to what extent you see that if there is anything to be said about the political as well as the economic impact that these two former colonial empires or their successor states still might have compared to other Western nation states. Is there anything to be said about that?
I'd say one issue that's top of mind for me, because it's part of what my team and I are charged with the responsibility of tackling, is how we improve our trade figures, particularly trade with the US. And when we look at international trade, we're still primarily trading goods that have no value addition. And that's very much part of a legacy, colonial legacy. And this is true in other parts of the continent as well, where you have long-standing agreements, trade agreements, and that would all like to disrupt. But your trade is also based on trust. And so where you have this generational trade that's taken place, we need to introduce new relationships and new standards so that we can move away from raw commodities, and this could be minerals, it could be agriculture as well, and start adding value, because that allows us to also start moving the country up the totem pole, be able to retain more value in country, because otherwise what you see happening is for some commodities we're a major exporter globally. Not just in the continent, but when you look at the impact, as I said, agriculture employs 60 to 70% of the people. Again, going back to the scorecard, over the past 20 years, the needle with respect to poverty hasn't moved much. So it's pretty stagnant. So that's a concern, right? And if most of those people are in the agricultural sector, and we're seeing that people are shifting away from agriculture, so labor is, or jobs are being created in construction, but that construction is also being driven by the public sector, so that's concerning. That's a problem, right? Because that's where a lot of the poverty is. It's people who are involved in that sector. And there's historical reasons for it, as I pointed out, but then we need to disrupt that and provide alternatives that can change that scenario. But trade is very sticky, right? So once you have trade arrangements, they tend to stay entrenched, because it also becomes intergenerational. And a lot of the traders or businesses involved in trade are also family businesses, right? And so you can't change those. Yeah. I'll give an example. About a week ago, we held a webinar with potential buyers. So we have some buyers in the US who are interested in sourcing tea and coffee from Tanzania, and then we also had retailers, so they're actually producing branded tea and coffee in Tanzania, and they're already selling in the US. And then we want them to share their experience with others who would like to sell tea and coffee to the US but don't know how. And again, buyers, better able to understand what it takes, which is not just knowing where to source the tea and coffee, but really how to negotiate and navigate customs, getting all the permits that are required. And what was striking is that there were some wholesalers who invited to participate, and they both, they declined, right? They said they have their own agreements, they're not interested in participating in that kind of conversation. So we have to find new avenues and new players. The old entrenched players, have a system that works for them. Why should they change it?
So let's think of this as Ambassador Kanza Part 1. The next episode in this serial is tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Well, thank you for a wonderful start, Elsie.